The night was thick with rain, a relentless downpour that had lasted all evening. Thunder rolled in low, vibrating through the walls of the old house that stood alone at the edge of the forest. I was there on a job, an overnight security gig at the abandoned estate of a wealthy family who'd left town decades ago. The kind of place with a dark past, the stories of which I'd dismissed as local folklore. But that night, beneath the storm and shadow, those stories came alive. I arrived just before sunset, the driveway a long, twisting stretch of cracked asphalt, overgrown with weeds. The house itself was a massive Victorian relic with peeling paint, sagging porches, and windows that stared like empty eyes. My client had warned me the place might be creepy, but assured me it was perfectly safe. Just an old house. I didn't have much choice. The job paid well, and I needed the money. By the time I stepped inside, the sky was dark and the first thunderclap shook the ground. The house smelled of damp wood, mold, and something faintly metallic. I set up my station near the front door, a small corner cluttered with a fold-out chair, a lamp, and an old walkie-talkie. The electricity was cut off, so I relied on my flashlight and the occasional flash of lightning. As the rain battered the windows, I tried to keep my nerves steady. The house groaned around me. Every creak and pop amplified in the silence. I heard the scurrying of rats, the distant drip of water, but mostly there was just the storm, and then a sudden knock. It was soft, but definite, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere upstairs. I froze, heart pounding. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The storm drowned out any echoes. I told myself it was probably the wind knocking loose a shutter or a branch brushing the house less, but the knocks came again. Clearer this time. Slow. 3 knocks. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The upstairs hallway stretched out like a tunnel of darkness, doors lining both sides. The knocking stopped as soon as I reached the top. I checked the first door on the left. It was locked. The second door was cracked open. I shone my light inside. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair, gently moving back and forth as if pushed by an unseen hand. I stepped inside, feeling the chill in the air, my breath fogged in the darkness. I called out again, but no answer came. Suddenly, the chair stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then, from the far corner of the room, I saw it. A faint figure of a woman, barely visible in the shadows. She was dressed in a long white gown, her hair hanging wet and tangled. Her face was pale, eyes hollow and dark, staring straight at me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The air around me grew colder, and the room seemed to close in. She raised a pale hand slowly, pointing toward the doorway. I turned and fled down the stairs without looking back, the pounding rain and thunder echoing my own heartbeat. Back on the first floor, I tried to steady myself. The knocking resumed, this time at the front door. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow knocks. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. No one. Just the storm. I slammed the door shut, locking it firmly. The rest of the night passed in restless unease. Every so often the knocking would return, soft, 3 taps at a time, coming from different parts of the house. The rocking chair would move again when no one was there. Whispering voices drifted through the halls, just at the edge of hearing. At dawn, I was ready to leave. But as I packed up, I found something on the front porch. A small, soaked bundle wrapped in old cloth. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a tattered doll, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye missing. Tucked inside the bundle was a note written in faded ink, "Don't forget me." I left the estate immediately, the storm finally breaking as the sun rose. I never returned. Weeks later, I researched the house and discovered the tragic story of a mother who lost her child in the very same storm decades ago. Neighbors reported hearing knocks and whispers, and some claimed to see the rocking chair move on its own. I've never worked a job so haunted, and whenever a storm brews, I swear I still hear the 3 taps, slow and deliberate, somewhere in the darkness. Story the end. The rain had been relentless all day, a heavy gray curtain smearing the edges of the world. Outside, the wind tossed branches violently against the window panes of the old house where Sarah had found herself trapped. She had come to this remote cottage on the outskirts of a forgotten town, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of city life. Instead, the storm seemed intent on trapping her in a prison of cold shadows and ceaseless thunder. The electricity had flickered and finally surrendered, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah lit the candles she'd brought, their small flames struggling against the oppressive gloom. Outside, the thunder rolled like distant drums, the sky jagged with lightning that briefly illuminated the twisted limbs of ancient trees surrounding the house. Sarah pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and sat on the worn armchair near the fireplace, but the cold bit deeper than the chill in the air. The house groaned under the weight of the storm. Every creak and whisper of the wind seemed alive, watching her. Her thoughts drifted back to the strange story the elderly woman at the local store had told her just hours ago. The woman's eyes had been wide, her voice barely above a whisper. "That house holds secrets, dear. You best be careful when the storm comes. It's not just the weather that howls in the night." Sarah had dismissed it then, thinking it a typical rural superstition. Now, alone and trapped, she wasn't so sure. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. Sarah froze, the candlelight flickering wildly. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded as she debated whether to open it. Outside, the storm raged on, the rain hammering down like nails on wood. Gathering courage, she stood and moved toward the door. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. As she reached the door, the knocking stopped. She hesitated, hand trembling on the doorknob. She peeked through the peephole but saw nothing but swirling rain and shadows. Relieved but uneasy, Sarah stepped back and locked the door. Returning to the living room, she sat again in the armchair, but then a soft tapping came from the window beside her. She turned, heart in her throat. The window was fogged with rain, but faintly visible was a pale figure, a woman, her face blurred but unmistakably staring inside. Sarah gasped, stumbling back. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Sarah could see her breath misting in front of her. The candle flames flickered and dimmed. From the darkness, a whisper drifted, barely audible over the storm. "Help me." Sarah's skin crawled. "Who's there?" she whispered. No answer. Suddenly, the floor beneath her seemed to shift, as if the house itself was breathing. Determined to understand, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and made her way upstairs to the attic, the only place she hadn't yet explored. The stairs creaked ominously beneath her. At the top, the attic door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, the beam of light swept over dusty trunks, broken furniture, and forgotten memories. In the corner, a faded rocking chair moved slowly back and forth, though no breeze could reach it here. Sarah approached, heart hammering, and saw a tattered doll sitting on the chair. Suddenly, a cold hand touched her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. Her breath came in short gasps as a voice whispered close to her ear, "Find the locket." The flashlight flickered and died. The attic plunged into darkness. A piercing scream cut through the storm, chilling Sarah to her core. The next morning, the storm had passed. Neighbors later found Sarah's abandoned car by the roadside. She was never seen again. Sometimes on stormy nights, locals say the rocking chair in that attic still moves, and a soft whisper rides the wind, begging for help. Story the end. The rain had been falling steadily since the late afternoon, turning the quiet country road into a slick, winding ribbon of mud and puddles. The sky was a heavy, bruised gray, clouds pressing low and threatening more storm as night began to settle in. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of trees that lined the roadside, their leafless limbs scratching and tapping against the sides of the old two-story farmhouse I was approaching. I had agreed to house sit for my aunt who was away for the weekend, but as I pulled my car up the long gravel driveway and stepped out into the cold, the ominous atmosphere swallowed me whole. The farmhouse sat stoic and worn, its paint chipped and faded from years of neglect, windows dark and lifeless, save for one small flickering light in the upstairs room. A chill skittered down my spine despite the heavy coat wrapped around me. The house seemed to breathe with the storm, a slow, measured inhale and exhale in the gusting wind. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the rusty hinges adding to the soundtrack of creaks and whispers that filled the cavernous entryway. Inside, the air was damp and musty, smelling of aged wood, forgotten memories, and something else, something faintly metallic and cold. The floorboards moaned beneath my boots as I made my way through the dimly lit rooms, lighting candles one by one and trying to shake the growing sense of unease tightening around my chest. The house was old, older than my aunt had said, with a long history tangled in local rumors and whispered warnings. I'd never believed in ghosts, but even I couldn't deny the oppressive feeling that the walls held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. Hours passed. The rain hammered against the windows with increasing fury, lightning flared and illuminated the house in stark white, followed by thunder that rumbled like a low growl in the distance. I sat in the parlor, curled under a blanket with a book, but my eyes kept darting to the darkened hallway. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, stretching longer and deeper, like black tendrils reaching out for me. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps above me. Soft, deliberate, and slow. They didn't belong to the house settling. This was something else. I froze, listening as the steps paused outside a bedroom door at the end of the hallway. I could almost hear breathing, ragged and shallow. I told myself it was my imagination. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds came again, louder this time, accompanied by a cold draft that swept through the corridor, carrying with it a whisper. The voice was barely audible, almost drowned out by the storm, but it spoke a name. My name. Fear rooted me to the spot. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed the flashlight and crept up the creaky staircase, the beam cutting a thin path through the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, the walls closing in like a trap. At the top, the hallway stretched out before me, empty and silent save for the flickering candlelight from under the farthest door. I approached the door, hand trembling, and pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, but the air was thick with something oppressive. Grief, despair, anger. The window rattled as the wind howled outside, and on the floor lay an old, worn photograph, its edges curled and stained. It showed a woman and a child smiling, but with eyes that seemed too knowing, too sad. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. The candle flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The room grew unbearably cold, and I heard the whisper again, clearer this time, desperate. "Help me!" Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, yanking it open, only to find the hallway transformed. The walls bled shadows, twisting and writhing, and at the end stood the figure of a woman, translucent, pale, her eyes hollow and accusing. She reached out a hand, fingers trembling like a leaf in the wind. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and fled down the stairs. The house groaned around me as if in pain, the storm outside reaching a furious crescendo. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, slamming the doors and locking them tight. The engine roared to life, and I sped away down the winding road, the farmhouse disappearing behind me like a bad dream. Later, I learned the history of the house. Decades ago, a woman named Eleanor had lived there with her young son. One stormy night, much like this one, her son vanished without a trace. Some said she had gone mad searching for him. Others whispered darker things, that the house itself had taken him. Eleanor was never seen again, but locals claim her spirit still wanders the halls, trapped in eternal sorrow. I don't doubt it. Some nights, when the wind howls just right and the sky is heavy with storm, I swear I hear a soft whisper on the breeze, my name carried on the dark air, pleading for help that will never come. Story the end. The rain began softly in the late afternoon, a quiet patter against the windows of the old farmhouse on the outskirts of Maplewood. By the time night had fully settled, the storm had gathered strength. Fierce gusts tore at the trees, and relentless sheets of rain hammered the tin roof with deafening force. Thunder rumbled deep and low, echoing through the hills as lightning split the sky with brilliant, jagged cracks. Inside the farmhouse, Anna sat curled on the worn leather sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The dim light from a single candle flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. The power had gone out hours ago, the storm having knocked the lines down somewhere miles away. She had resigned herself to a night of solitude and unease. Anna had inherited the house from her grandfather not long after his passing. It was an old place, the kind of house that creaked and sighed in the wind, full of narrow halls and creaky floors. She hadn't expected the loneliness to feel so heavy, especially not on nights like this, when the storm seemed to press itself against the very walls. As the minutes dragged on, the storm's fury outside became a constant roar in her ears. Every gust sent shudders through the old windows, and rainwater trickled down the glass in cold rivulets. Her thoughts began to drift to the stories her grandfather used to tell, stories of the house's past, of the strange happenings in the dead of night. She had always dismissed them as old man tales, the product of too many quiet evenings alone. But now, alone in the dark, they returned with unnerving clarity. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder made her jump. She gripped the blanket tighter, heart pounding. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, but distinct. Footsteps on the floor above her. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was just the house settling, the old wood expanding and contracting with the cold. But the footsteps continued, steady and unmistakable. She called out, voice trembling, "Hello." No answer. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence. She forced herself to stand and reach for the flashlight she kept in the drawer. Its weak beam swept the dark room, settling on the staircase leading upstairs. She took a hesitant step toward it. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. She was left in near darkness, save for the faint glow of the candle. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she reached up to light another candle, her hands shaking. As the new flame caught, it cast a flickering light down the narrow hallway upstairs, revealing the slightly ajar door of her grandfather's study. She stepped quietly up the stairs, every creak seeming far too loud. Her candlelight wavered as a sudden gust of wind brushed past her, chilling the air. She peered into the study. The room was empty, yet a faint icy chill lingered. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the corner near the window. Pale, shadowy, almost translucent, but unmistakably human-shaped. Anna's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The figure turned slowly, revealing eyes that seemed hollow, endless wells of darkness. A voice whispered from the shadows, "You shouldn't be here." Anna stumbled back, nearly dropping the candle. The flame flickered violently as a sudden gust swept through the room, extinguishing it. Darkness engulfed her. She ran down the stairs blindly, her hands scraping against the walls as she sought the front door. But it wouldn't open. No matter how hard she pulled, it was as if held shut by invisible hands. Behind her, the footsteps followed, slow and heavy. Then a low, guttural whisper filled the air, repeating over and over, "Leave, leave." Panic rising, Anna spun around, shining her broken flashlight into the blackness. No one was there, but she could feel the presence, cold, oppressive, watching. With a desperate effort, she pulled at the door one last time. It gave way with a heavy creak. She burst into the rain, gasping and shivering. The storm hit her like a wall, cold water soaking her clothes instantly. She ran down the muddy path toward the road, never looking back. When she reached the safety of a neighbor's porch, she collapsed, trembling. Later, she learned that the house had a dark history, a history her grandfather had never shared. Decades ago, a man had lived there, a recluse who vanished without a trace during a violent storm, much like this one. Locals whispered that his spirit never left, trapped between the walls of the old farmhouse, doomed to roam the halls during stormy nights. Anna never returned. The house sits empty now, silent and waiting. And when the rain falls hard, some say you can still hear the footsteps pacing the floors above. Story the end. The storm was relentless that night. A heavy, unyielding rain hammered the town, flooding the streets and turning every window pane into a foggy, trembling mirror. The wind tore at the trees, bending branches like brittle bones. Thunder crashed in furious roars, shaking the very foundation of the old house where I was staying. It was a night made for nightmares. I had come to this small, forgotten town in Maine to escape the chaos of city life and to clear my head after a difficult breakup. The house I rented was an old colonial, perched at the edge of the woods, isolated except for a gravel road that wound back into the darkness of the trees. The owner was an elderly woman, Mrs. Harper, who handed me the keys with a wary look and a whispered warning. The house has a history. People say it's unsettled, but you're just passing through, so it should be fine. I laughed it off, assuming it was a local superstition, something townsfolk tell tourists to spice up their stay. The house was charming in the daylight, creaky floors and all, and I was determined to make the best of the stormy evening. By 7 p.m., the power flickered once and then went out. I was already prepared. Candles were scattered across the living room and kitchen, casting dancing shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The rain came down harder, drumming a relentless rhythm. The air grew heavy and cold, despite the fireplace I had lit earlier. Sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, I tried to read, but found myself distracted by the eerie quiet between the bursts of thunder. That's when I first heard it, the soft creaking of floorboards coming from the staircase just beyond the living room. I paused. The house was supposed to be empty except for me. I told myself it must be the house settling, or maybe a branch scraping the siding outside. But the sound came again, slow and deliberate steps on the wooden stairs moving downward. I stood up, heart pounding, and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Just the sound of rain and distant thunder. I grabbed my phone to call Mrs. Harper, but realized I had no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. The old landline phone in the hallway was dead, no dial tone. I had no choice but to investigate. The staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed. The hallway above was dimly lit by a single candle on the wall, flickering as if struggling against the darkness. At the end of the hall was the guest bedroom, the one I had been told was never used. The door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I reached out and pushed the door open fully. The room was empty, except for the rocking chair by the window, which was moving gently as if someone had just stood up. The rain hammered the window beside it, and the faint outline of a figure was visible outside, blurred and indistinct. I blinked, and the rocking chair stopped. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and yanked at the handle. It wouldn't open. Panic flooded through me. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but only the storm answered. A whisper floated through the room, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. "Please." I froze. The voice was faint, fragile, and desperate. "Who's there?" I called, voice trembling. No reply. The room grew colder, my breath misting in front of me. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." I backed away slowly, my eyes searching the shadows. From the corner a pale face emerged, a woman's, eyes hollow and sad, her hair wet and tangled, wearing an old-fashioned nightgown. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. I stumbled back, knocking over the candle, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew thick, and I felt invisible hands grip my shoulders. I screamed and pushed them off, running to the door again. This time it swung open easily. I didn't stop to think. I bolted down the stairs and out the front door into the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes as I ran down the gravel road, not looking back until the house was a shadow swallowed by the night. The next day, I learned the truth. The woman I saw was Mary Caldwell, who had lived there with her husband over a century ago. According to local legend, her husband went mad during a fierce storm and locked her in the guest room where she died alone, calling out for help that never came. The house was said to be cursed, haunted by her restless spirit, especially on stormy nights like the one I had endured. I never returned to that town, but sometimes when the sky darkens and the wind whispers through the trees, I feel that same chill creeping over me, and I remember Mary's voice, soft, pleading, forever trapped in the storm. Story the end. The rain started as a faint drizzle late in the afternoon, but by nightfall it was a furious downpour, hammering the tin roof of the small house nestled at the edge of the old forest. The sky was a thick, rolling blanket of charcoal clouds, and the wind carried with it a mournful howl, shaking the ancient trees like they were about to collapse. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing through the valley, a low growl warning of the storm's increasing rage. Inside, the house creaked and groaned under the weight of the weather, its wooden frame shivering like a living thing. I had arrived just before the storm began, a last-minute decision driven by curiosity and a sense of obligation. The house belonged to my late grandmother, a woman who had lived a quiet life in this village, but whose past was marked by whispered stories and uneasy silences among the neighbors. Since her passing, I'd inherited the property, and though the townsfolk advised me against staying overnight, especially on nights like this, I chose to spend the evening sorting through her belongings before preparing the house for sale. The house was old, built more than a century ago, with thick walls, narrow hallways, and creaky floorboards that protested underfoot. The furniture was covered in sheets, dust motes danced in the dim light of the oil lamp, and the air smelled of damp wood and forgotten memories. The storm outside cast flickering shadows through the windows, creating the illusion that the trees were dancing to a dark, sinister rhythm. I settled into the worn armchair near the fireplace, trying to steady my nerves. The fire sputtered, casting weak light that barely pushed back the surrounding darkness. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room in stark relief, and with each burst, my heart seemed to skip a beat. The wind howled again, louder this time, shaking the windows, and I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders. As the minutes passed, I thought I heard something. Soft footsteps above me, on the creaky wooden floor of the second story. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps an animal trapped somewhere in the attic. But the footsteps persisted, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth just overhead. My curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing the oil lamp, I climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath my weight. The upstairs hallway was a shadowy corridor lined with closed doors, the air thick and cold. The footsteps stopped as I reached the top. I moved cautiously, the lamp's flickering light revealing faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and photographs covered in dust. At the end of the hall was the guest bedroom, my grandmother's favorite room, I was told. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for the bed draped in white sheets and a small dresser with a cracked mirror. The air was colder here, almost biting. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart pounding, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lamp flickered wildly and then went out, plunging me into darkness. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, and the screen was too dim to illuminate the room. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and pleading, coming from the corner. "Help me." I froze. The voice was unmistakably female, fragile yet desperate. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice trembling. No answer. But the temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. From the shadows emerged a faint figure, a woman in an old-fashioned white dress, her face pale and eyes hollow, her hair damp and tangled as if she'd just come from the river. She reached out a translucent hand toward me. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. "Please," she repeated, "find him." The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in, and then suddenly I was outside the room, the door wide open as if it had never been locked. The footsteps were gone. The storm had quieted, leaving only the dripping of rain from the eaves. I fled down the stairs, out into the night, the cold rain washing over me, heart racing. The village was silent. The storm passed, but leaving a heavy gloom. In the morning, I found an old diary tucked away in a drawer. It was my grandmother's, and inside were pages filled with anguish over a brother who had drowned in the river nearby many years ago. The villagers said his spirit never left the waters, calling for help, trapped between life and death. I never stayed in the house again, but sometimes, on stormy nights like that one, I hear the soft tapping at the window and the faint whisper of a desperate voice calling out, asking for help. Story the end. The storm was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't just the rain, though it hammered down in sheets, blurring the edges of everything outside the small cabin where I had taken refuge. It was the way the winds screamed through the trees, twisting branches until they groaned and snapped, and the darkness seemed to press close enough to suffocate. I'd been driving all afternoon, trying to escape the city and clear my head after a rough week. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a place to rest. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I arrived just before dusk, the gravel driveway slick with mud. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, isolated and weather-beaten. The porch sagged under years of neglect, and the windows were clouded with grime. Still, it was shelter, and with the storm closing in fast, I was grateful. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and mildew. The electricity was out, probably because of the storm, so I lit the lantern I found on the kitchen table. The flickering light cast shadows that danced on the walls, making the peeling wallpaper seem alive. I set down my bag, stripped off my wet jacket, and tried to settle in. The first few hours passed uneventfully, but as the storm grew fiercer, the atmosphere changed. The silence between the thunderclaps was heavy, almost unnatural. Then, faintly at first, I heard it. A tapping. Soft, deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. I told myself it was just a tree branch knocking against the window. But when I moved to check, the sound stopped. I returned to the living room, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I noticed it. The rocking chair. It was old and worn, tucked into a corner by the fireplace. It hadn't been moving when I arrived, but now it was gently rocking back and forth as if someone had just stood up. I told myself there was a draft, that the old floorboards creaked and shifted with the storm. But the rocking chair kept moving, slow and steady, with no one near it. I moved to stop it, but as I reached out, the chair suddenly stopped. The room grew cold. I could see my breath. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, dragging steps, coming down the hall toward the stairs. I froze. The cabin was supposed to be empty. I wasn't expecting anyone. The footsteps stopped just above me. I strained to listen, heart pounding. A whisper, barely audible, drifted down. Leave. The lantern flickered violently. The walls seemed to close in. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and ran out the door into the storm. The rain drenched me instantly. Thunder crashed overhead as I ran down the driveway, the cabin shrinking behind me, swallowed by the night and the storm. I never returned. Weeks later, I learned the cabin had a dark history. Years ago, a family had vanished there during a violent storm. The youngest child was never found. Locals say on stormy nights, you can still hear the rocking chair creak and footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. Some say it's the family, waiting for someone to find them. Others say it's something, but I know one thing. When the storm rages and the night falls thick and gloomy, that cabin is alive with something not of this world. Story the end. The night was thick with rain and an unforgiving wind that tore through the skeletal branches of the trees lining the narrow country road. I was driving slow, headlights cutting through the dark, and the sheets of water that hammered the windshield. The storm had been brewing since late afternoon, and now it seemed to have reached a ferocity that made the world beyond my car disappear. The only thing that felt real was the constant slap of rain, the rumbling thunder, and the occasional sharp flash of lightning. I was headed to the old family cabin, a weathered wooden structure my grandfather had built decades ago deep in the forest. It had always been a place of refuge for my family, but now, after his passing, the cabin sat mostly abandoned. The rest of the family had stopped coming years ago, citing the bad feelings and the way the place seemed to warp in stormy weather. But I wanted to check it myself, clear out some of the dust, maybe bring it back to life. The gravel driveway was slick and uneven, and I had to ease the car carefully to avoid sliding off into the ditch. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered. The porch sagged on one side, and the faded paint peeled like old scabs. I grabbed my bag and flashlight and stepped out into the cold storm. The wind hit me like a slap, soaked me instantly despite my coat. I tried the front door. It was locked, but not tightly. The old key I found hidden in a flower pot outside fit perfectly. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath my boots. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, mildew, and something else, something faint and metallic, like rusted iron. The power was out, so I lit a candle on the small kitchen table. Shadows leapt along the walls, and the house felt impossibly silent, except for the storm's roar outside. I called out, half expecting an answer, but there was nothing. No signs of life. I spent some time wandering through the cabin, dusting and opening windows despite the rain to air the place out. Upstairs was a single bedroom, cluttered with old furniture covered in sheets. The bed looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. As I settled into a creaky armchair in the living room, the wind outside intensified. Thunder cracked above, shaking the windows. The candle flickered, threatening to go out, but I held it steady. Then I heard it, the softest whisper, almost drowned by the storm. I froze, straining to listen. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. It was a name, my grandfather's name. James. I told myself it was the wind or my imagination. But then came a slow, deliberate tapping on the window behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but rain lashing against the glass. The tapping came again, followed by a scraping noise, like nails dragging on wood. I grabbed the candle and edged toward the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. But the porch was empty, save for the swaying branches. Suddenly, the candle went out. I was plunged into darkness, save for the flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the room. In one flash, I saw a figure standing at the foot of the stairs. Tall, shadowy, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Panic surged through me. I stumbled upstairs to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, trying to control my breathing, the storm pounding around the cabin like a living beast. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard footsteps, heavy and uneven, dragging along the floorboards. They stopped outside the door. A knock followed, slow, insistent. "James?" The voice was mournful and distant. My grandfather's voice. I pressed my ear to the door, but no one was there. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently. I stepped back, heart thudding wildly. The door creaked open on its own, revealing an empty hallway swallowed by shadows. A cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the last candle I had. In the darkness, I heard a soft sigh, like someone exhaling a lifetime of sorrow. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, I left the cabin and never returned. Years later, I learned the truth. My grandfather's wife, my grandmother, had vanished in a storm much like that one. They say her spirit still wanders the cabin, searching for him, trapped in eternal longing. Some nights, when the wind is right and the rain is falling hard, I swear I can hear her voice calling my grandfather's name, carried through the storm like a desperate plea. Story the end. The rain was unyielding, drumming against the cracked windows of the old house with the fury of 1,000 restless spirits. Outside, the wind twisted through the skeletal branches of trees, stripped bare by the relentless autumn chill. The sky was a tumultuous gray-black canvas, pierced every so often by jagged forks of lightning that revealed, for split seconds, the silhouette of the house perched precariously on the edge of the forgotten hill. Inside, the dim flicker of a single candle cast long, quivering shadows along the peeling wallpaper. Daniel sat curled in an old armchair, clutching a worn journal and trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere thick with the scent of damp wood and something far older, something that felt like sorrow soaked into the very walls. He wasn't supposed to be there. But the house was his inheritance, left to him by a distant uncle who had vanished decades ago. The townsfolk whispered strange things about the place, how it was cursed, haunted, forsaken. But Daniel was a man of science, a man who demanded proof, not ghost stories or superstitions. So when he got the letter informing him of his uncle's death and the strange circumstances surrounding it, he decided to come and see for himself. He'd arrived that afternoon, the storm already gathering as if it had been waiting for his arrival. The house greeted him like a tired sentinel, creaking beneath the weight of its secrets. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something else, the residue of years of neglect and silence. As Daniel unpacked some of the old belongings, faded photographs, yellowed letters, and a locked box that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, the storm outside began to crescendo. The thunder shook the house, rattling windows and doors, making the floorboards groan like the sighs of unseen giants. He settled by the fireplace, trying to read through the letters, but the words blurred as the candlelight flickered and his nerves frayed. The house seemed alive, breathing around him, closing in. At precisely midnight, the power cut out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the occasional glare of lightning. The silence was broken by a soft tapping, coming from upstairs. Heart hammering, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and cautiously ascended the narrow staircase. The landing was cold, the air thick and heavy. The tapping turned into soft footsteps, slow and measured. He moved down the corridor, past closed doors, until he reached the end, the door to his uncle's study, which was ajar. Inside, the room was bathed in a ghostly glow as the flashlight revealed a circle of strange symbols drawn on the floor, chalk dust glittering faintly in the intermittent light. In the center lay an open book, its pages worn and filled with arcane writing. As Daniel stepped closer, a sudden chill ran through the room. He felt the presence before he saw it, a shadow, shifting, coalescing into the form of a man, his uncle. The apparition's eyes were hollow, yet they burned with desperation. "Help me," the figure whispered, voice a brittle echo, trapped by what I sought to unleash. Daniel's blood ran cold as the room darkened further and a chorus of anguished voices filled his ears. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. With trembling hands, Daniel closed the book, breaking the circle. The ghostly figure shuddered, then vanished, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The storm outside started to subside, the first pale light of dawn bleeding through the windows. Daniel fled the house, never to return. But sometimes, when the rain pounds heavy and the wind howls through the trees, the neighbors swear they see flickering lights and hear whispers of a man still searching for release. Story the end. The rain hammered down with a relentless fury, turning the narrow country lane into a slick ribbon of mud and puddles. Thunder rumbled low and deep, shaking the very ground beneath my feet, while flashes of lightning tore jagged scars across the sky. It was the kind of storm that made the night feel alive with something restless and hungry, something waiting, just beyond the reach of the flickering porch light. I pulled up to the old farmhouse, its peeling white paint glowing faintly in the strobe of the storm. The house sat perched at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines that bent and groaned under the weight of the wind. This place had belonged to my grandfather, a man I barely knew and who had passed away a few months earlier. I had come out here on a whim, to pack up what remained and close the chapter on a family history that was more mystery than memory. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped inside, and the door groaned shut behind me. The air was heavy with dust and the scent of old wood, dampened by years of neglect. I struck a match and lit the candle on the kitchen table. Its wavering flame cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and twist along the cracked walls. The house was quiet, too quiet. Every sound outside was muffled by the storm, but inside the silence pressed in like a living thing. I made my way through the dim rooms, trying to shake the chill that wasn't just from the cold air. Something felt off, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. By nightfall, the storm showed no sign of abating. The power flickered and died, leaving me with nothing but candlelight and the wild symphony of rain and wind. I wrapped myself in a heavy blanket and sat near the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames, trying to quell the uneasy feeling gnawing at my mind. Then, from somewhere above, I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the floorboards. My heart leapt into my throat. No one else was supposed to be here. I listened, breath shallow, as the footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door at the end of the hall. I called out softly, "Hello." No answer. Just silence, thick and unyielding. A cold draft swept down the hallway, carrying with it a faint scent, something floral, old-fashioned, like lavender and dust. I swallowed my fear and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness as I climbed the stairs. At the top, the air was colder, the walls seeming to close in. The bedroom door was shut tight, but I felt a pull toward it, as if something was waiting for me there. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. Before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own with a slow, mournful creak. Inside, the room was empty except for an old rocking chair in the corner, moving gently back and forth as if someone had just left it. I stepped inside, the beam of the flashlight scanning the room. On the wall, an old photograph hung crookedly, a woman and a child, their faces blurred and faded with time. The rocking chair stopped abruptly, and a chill ran through me. Suddenly, a whisper brushed past my ear, a soft, desperate plea that sent my blood cold. "Stay." I whirled around, but no one was there. Panic surged, and I fled down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The storm raged louder than ever, thunder shaking the windows. I sat back down near the fireplace, heart pounding. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Don't leave me." I realized then that the house was not empty. Someone was trapped here, caught between worlds, longing and lost. I stayed until dawn, too frightened to sleep, listening to the storm and the sorrowful whispers. When morning finally came, the sun's weak light felt like a balm, and I left the farmhouse behind, the weight of its secrets heavy on my soul. Years later, I learned the story of my grandfather's wife, who had vanished one stormy night without a trace. Some say her spirit never left, forever searching for the family she lost. Sometimes on stormy nights, I still hear her voice carried on the wind, soft, pleading, and filled with sorrow. Story the end. The rain began just before dusk, a soft drizzle at first that quickly grew into a relentless downpour, hammering the small town of Millfield with an unforgiving fury. The sky darkened early beneath the heavy clouds, swallowing the last traces of daylight as the wind twisted the skeletal branches of the ancient trees lining the narrow road to my grandmother's house. It was a night tailor-made for fear. Stormy, gloomy, and unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put into words. I arrived at the house alone, a faded Victorian relic nestled between gnarled oaks and a thick underbrush that crept too close to the windows. The house had been in my family for generations, but my grandmother had passed the previous autumn, and I was here to settle her affairs. This was the first time I had been back since the funeral. The porch groaned beneath my boots as I pushed open the heavy front door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly floral. The remnants of my grandmother's perfume, I assumed. The flickering of the single overhead bulb threw long shadows across the room, revealing faded wallpaper peeling at the corners and furniture draped with white sheets like ghostly sentinels. Outside, the wind began to scream, rattling the windows violently as the rain intensified. I set my bags down and lit the fireplace, welcoming the flickering warmth that barely chased away the chill. With a small lantern in hand, I began the task of going through my grandmother's things, sorting the piles of letters, photographs, and old trinkets that time had tangled. Hours passed as the storm raged outside. The house seemed to breathe around me, creaking softly, settling with the rhythm of the wind. I told myself it was just an old house, nothing more. But then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, echoing on the creaky wooden floor of the second story. I froze, the lantern shaking slightly in my grasp. "Hello?" I called, voice barely audible over the thunder. No response. The footsteps continued, pausing briefly just beyond the room overhead, then moving again, fading down the hallway before stopping entirely. I swallowed hard and told myself it was just the house. Maybe the wind had loosened a shutter or a tree branch scraped the roof, but an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I made my way up the narrow staircase, the wooden steps moaning beneath each careful footfall. The second floor was dark, the storm's fury filtering through the old windows and casting distorted shadows across the hallway. I passed the bedrooms, each door closed, except the last one at the far end, my grandmother's room. The door was slightly open. A cold draft swept the hallway as I pushed it wider. The room was empty, except for the bed, neatly made, and an old rocking chair sitting by the window. But the chair was moving, gently rocking back and forth, as though someone had just left it. My breath hitched. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart racing, and grabbed the doorknob. It was locked tight. A chill swept through the room. I saw a faint mist rise from the floor, coalescing into a figure, a woman in a white dress, her face pale and sorrowful, eyes sunken and dark. She raised her hand slowly and whispered, "Please." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. "Help me," she said, voice trembling like a distant echo. The rocking chair stopped. Then she vanished. The door creaked open on its own. I bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out the front door into the storm. The rain soaked me through, thunder crashing overhead as I ran to the neighbor's house down the road. The next day I learned the story. My grandmother's sister lost decades ago in a house fire that claimed her life. Locals said her spirit never left, trapped in a limbo of sorrow and regret. I never returned to the house. But sometimes when the storm rolls in and the night grows dark and heavy, I swear I hear the creak of a rocking chair and the soft whisper of a woman begging for help. Story. The end. The rain started as a light drizzle in the late afternoon, but by evening it had thickened into a relentless downpour. Outside, the streets of Millville were slick and empty, the sky a dense sheet of gray with lightning flaring sporadically in the distance. The wind howled, carrying the scent of wet earth and cold stone, rattling the old window panes of the cottage where Julia lived alone. Julia had moved into the cottage a little over a month ago, seeking refuge from the city after a messy breakup and the stress of her job. The house was nestled at the edge of the woods, old and charming, with its faded shutters and a porch sagging under the weight of years. At first it had felt like a sanctuary, a place to heal and find peace. But nights like this, the stormy, gloomy ones, were beginning to twist that feeling into something else entirely. She sat curled on the couch, a thick blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her laptop was closed on the coffee table, unread emails piling up in her mind. The only sound in the room was the steady patter of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. The power had flickered twice and then died just before 8 o'clock, plunging the house into dim candlelight. The candle flames danced nervously, casting long shadows against the walls that seemed to shift and breathe in the gloom. Julia's eyes kept drifting toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Every few minutes, she thought she heard the softest whisper, almost like a sigh, carried on the draft. She told herself it was just the wind. The house was old. It made noises. She had to believe that. At 9:15 p.m., the whispers became footsteps. Not loud or frantic, but slow, deliberate. They came from the hallway upstairs, quiet but heavy enough to make her blood run cold. Julia's breath hitched, and she wrapped the blanket tighter. She tried calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But her voice caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped abruptly. She told herself it was her imagination, but the hair on her arms prickled. The air seemed to grow colder. Slowly, she stood and reached for her phone, only to realize it had died during the storm hours earlier. Panic flickered. The darkness seemed to press inward, tightening like a noose. The footsteps began again, closer now, descending the stairs. Julia's heart pounded against her ribs. She backed away from the staircase toward the living room window. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the silhouette of a figure at the base of the stairs, a man, tall and thin, but his face was obscured by shadows. The light vanished, and the figure was gone. Julia stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The candle blew out suddenly, leaving her in total darkness. Her hands trembled as she struck a match and lit the candle again. The flame flickered weakly. She scanned the room desperately. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time, like breath on her ear. "Leave." Her blood ran cold. She ran to the front door, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her now, a chorus of voices layered in agony and warning. Desperate, she turned back toward the living room, and there he was again, the figure, but now his face was visible. Pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and black, mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Julia froze, unable to move or scream. The figure raised a hand slowly, pointing directly at her. "Leave," it hissed. Then the lights flickered back on, bright and sudden, banishing the figure and the voices. The rain still fell hard outside, but the oppressive feeling had lifted. Julia collapsed onto the floor, shaking. She called the police, but no one else saw or heard anything unusual. The officers attributed it to the storm and stress. In the weeks that followed, Julia researched the house's history and uncovered a chilling truth. The original owner was a man named Thomas Gray, who lived there alone after his family died tragically in a fire decades before. Town records hinted at his descent into madness and eventual disappearance during a violent storm. Never found, presumed dead. Neighbors whispered that his spirit haunted the house, trapped by grief and rage, especially on stormy nights. Julia left the cottage soon after, unable to endure the haunting presence. The house stands empty now, its windows boarded and its stories whispered only in the darkest storms. Some say that when the rain falls hard and the wind screams through the trees, you can still hear footsteps pacing the stairs and a voice, faint but clear, warning all who enter to leave. Story the end. The night began like any other, at least on the surface. Thick clouds hung low, swallowing the moon and stars, while rain fell steadily, drumming against the roof of the small village house where I had come to stay. It was my first trip back home in over 5 years, a visit intended to sort through my late grandmother's belongings and decide what to keep and what to sell. But the air around the house carried a weight I hadn't felt since childhood, a quiet dread that seeped into my bones. The house itself was old, a single-story structure with peeling paint and windows that rattled in the wind. The storm had started in the late afternoon, and by nightfall had turned fierce. Thunder growled in the distance, lightning crackled across the sky, and the wind swept through the trees like a wild thing hunting in the dark. I sat by the fireplace, the flickering flame casting uneasy shadows across the walls. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving me with only a candle and the occasional flash of lightning to keep me company. Outside, the world was a curtain of rain and darkness, isolating me completely. I tried to focus on the task ahead, sorting through boxes, photographs, and old letters, but my hands trembled, and the silence pressed heavily on my ears. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window, seemed to carry a whisper, a faint breath of something unseen. Then I heard it, a soft tapping at the front door. At first I thought it was just the rain or a branch scraping the wood, but the tapping was deliberate, rhythmic, slow, Tap, 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 like someone knocking, trying to get in. My heart quickened. I wasn't expecting anyone. The village was nearly empty in this storm, and the roads were flooded. I hesitated, then moved cautiously to the door, candle in hand. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the swirling storm. No figure, no light. The tapping stopped. I opened the door a crack, the cold wind rushing in. Nothing. The porch was empty, slick with rain. I closed the door, locking it firmly. But then came the whispering, soft and almost too faint to hear. It seemed to drift from the hallway behind me. Help me. I spun around, heart pounding. The hallway was dark, empty. The whisper repeated, clearer now. Help me. I grabbed my phone for light, but the screen flickered and died. The power outage was complete. With shaking hands, I made my way through the house, the candle casting long shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. The whispers followed me, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Upstairs, the guest room door stood slightly ajar. I remembered my grandmother mentioning the room had been locked for years, that ever since the accident. Summoning courage, I pushed the door open. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and filled with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. On the bed lay an old cracked photo frame. I picked it up, wiping away the dust to see a picture of a young girl with sorrowful eyes. Suddenly the candle flickered violently and went out, plunging me into darkness. A cold hand gripped my shoulder. I screamed, dropping the photo. When I turned, no one was there. The door slammed shut behind me. Trapped and terrified, I pressed myself against the wall, eyes straining to see in the dark. The whispering grew louder, voices overlapping in a mournful chorus. Find me. Help me. Then a figure appeared, a translucent woman in a white dress, her face pale and tear-streaked. Please, she said, voice barely a breath, find where I am. Before I could respond, she vanished. The door creaked open slowly, and I fled the house, rain soaking me as I stumbled into the night. Later, I learned the truth. Years ago, a young girl had disappeared from the village during a storm just like this one. Her body was never found, and locals said her spirit was trapped, calling out for help on stormy nights. I never went back to that house, but sometimes when the wind howls and the rain lashes against the windows, I still hear her whispers. Story. The end. The rain was relentless that night, beating down with a fury I hadn't experienced in years. The wind howled through the gaps in the old house like a living thing, rattling the shutters and bending the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks surrounding the property. The sky was an oppressive curtain of darkness, pierced only by jagged flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the landscape before plunging it back into gloom. Inside the creaking farmhouse, I sat alone by the fireplace, its faint glow barely holding back the oppressive shadows. I had come here to get away from the city, the noise, and the overwhelming loneliness that had started to seep into my bones. This old place, which once belonged to my grandmother, was supposed to be a refuge, a quiet sanctuary where I could clear my head and maybe, just maybe, find some peace. But from the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt something was wrong. It started with the house settling, I told myself, the creaks and groans of old wood adjusting to the chill. But then came the whispers. I first heard them just after the storm had begun, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of dry leaves. I paused in the kitchen, the cup of tea halfway to my lips, trying to catch the words, but they vanished when I focused. A trick of the wind, I assumed. Yet, as the night deepened, the whispers grew clearer, more persistent. They seemed to come from the hallway outside my bedroom, a low murmur rising and falling like voices in the next room. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet. The house was otherwise silent, the storm the only other sound. The whispers stopped. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. Old houses do that, right? They play tricks on the mind. But then the knocks began. At first, it was a single tap, gentle and spaced out, coming from the far end of the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I stood frozen, heart pounding. No one should be here. I crept toward the source, the dim light from the storm's flashes barely illuminating the walls. At the end of the hall was the door to the attic, a door that had always been locked and which I had never opened. Tonight, it was slightly ajar. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pushed it open. The attic was pitch black, filled with the scent of dust and old wood. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The room was empty, except for a small rocking chair, gently moving back and forth. The air was icy cold. My breath fogged in front of me. Then the whispers returned, louder now, echoing around the attic walls. The voice was unmistakable, a woman, softly calling a name I couldn't catch. Suddenly the chair stopped. The room fell silent. A shadow shifted in the corner. I squinted but saw nothing. I spun around to leave, but the attic door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into total darkness. Panic rose like bile. I pounded on the door, screaming, but the house swallowed my voice. Minutes passed, hours it felt, until a flash of lightning lit the room. In that brief glow, I saw her. A pale woman in a tattered white dress, eyes hollow, standing motionless beside the chair. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then she vanished. The door creaked open. I stumbled out and fled to my room, locking the door and barricading it with a dresser. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The storm raged on outside, each thunderclap shaking the house, and every so often the knocks resumed. 3 slow taps on my bedroom window. The next morning, the storm had passed. The house was silent, the heavy gloom lifted by the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. I found an old journal tucked beneath the floorboards in the attic. It belonged to a young woman named Eleanor, who lived here a century ago. Her final entry was chilling. "They will not let me rest. The night is alive with their sorrow." I never returned to that house after that night. Some nights, when the rain begins to fall and the wind picks up, I can still hear the tapping at my window, the faint whispering of a name long forgotten, and the gentle creak of a rocking chair in the dark. Story the end.